year 4 BCE, King Herod died. And as soon as he died, there was a time of transition before the Romans could put a new king in the area. And sensing that this would be a good time to lead a rebellion against the Romans, who were ruling that area, a young Galilean by the name of Judas, who was born in the city of Galilee, decided to lead a rebellion against the Romans. So he stormed Sepphoris's palace and went into the arsenal, pulled out all the weapons, and then gave all those weapons to his followers. And then together, Judas, who at this point was now being referred to as the Galilean, led this rebellion against the Roman army. Well, the rebellion was short-lived, and Judas and his followers scattered. Unfortunately, the Romans were not able to capture and kill Judas the Galilean, nor were they able to capture any of his top aides. So Judas and his followers scattered, disappeared into the throngs of humanity. And for a while, things were quiet, but then Quirinius became governor of Judea. And he decided that it was time to have a new census of all the people. He wanted the new census because that would mean more taxes, as new people were now being counted in his region. And so as soon as the Romans heard that Quirinius was going to launch this new census for the purpose of taxation, that triggered Judas, the Galilean, and his top aides to start rallying folks. And once again, Judas the Galilean and his comrades came bursting in on the scene. Only this time when they came back, they were radicalized. What do you mean by that? Well, before, when Judas was operating, he was just bent out of shape about disrupting Roman rule and killing Romans. But this time, when Judas the Galilean and his followers came back, they not only decided to vent their anger and wrath upon the Romans, but they turned their anger and wrath upon fellow Jews. Jews who were more moderate in their thought and who thought maybe they could get along when working with the Romans. And so Judas the Galilean and his followers started killing Jews as well as Romans. Their reign of terror was feared by Romans and Jews alike. But then one day, in a skirmish with the Roman army, Judas the Galilean was killed. And without their chief leader, once again the top aides and the followers just kind of scattered into the hillside and quietly disappeared. But they didn't stay in hiding long, because after about 10 years, they came back under new leadership. Only now they morphed into an organization called the Zealots. Have you heard of that term before? You might remember that one of Jesus' disciples was Judas the Zealot. And so now we have zealots that are on the scene. And the zealots, as their name suggested, were very verbal against the Romans and were very opportunistic in doing whatever they could to disrupt Roman rule. Now there was a group within the zealot organization that in time became radical extremists. They were called the Sicarii. They were called the Sicarii because these radical extremists decided that they would be assassins, trained assassins. And they were extremists because, again, much like Judas the Galilean, these Sicarii not only were killing Romans, but they were killing fellow Jews. Again, more moderate thinking Jews who wanted to get along and work with the Romans. They were called the Sicarii because the knife that they used was a small curved knife called the Sica. And so you've got the Zealots on the scene, and you've got the extreme radical group called the Sicarii. And it's the Sicarii that's wreaking havoc with the Romans. The Sicarii would be very similar to today's terrorist group called ISIS. They would be the ISIS of that day and age. Mass assassinations, mass annihilations. The Sicarii were noted for that, just like ISIS is today. But even though the Sicarii were terrorizing the Romans and fellow Jews, they came to an end. Because you see, the Roman army managed to surround the core group of the Sicarii, about 1,000 in number, in a fortress called Masada. Some of you might know about that term. And so, being surrounded by the Roman army, the Romans decided, we'll just wait the Sicarii out until they surrender. But the Sicarii, being radical extremism at their worst, decided that they were not going to surrender to the Romans, rather they would commit suicide. And so 960 Sicarii, men and women, killed themselves rather than surrender to the Romans. And with that mass suicide, the Sicarii, that radical extremist group, came to an end, and shortly after that, the Zealot group fell apart as well. Now, why do I share this history with you this morning? I share this history to make the point that radical extremism is always a dead end. Hear that? Radical extremism is always a dead end. For whenever it raises its ugly head, whether in biblical times or in modern times, its fate is always one of death. Yes, they flourish for a little bit. Yes, they kill and destroy and maim and wreak havoc for a period of time. But invariably, the testimony of history is that radical extremism dies. And that is exactly the point that the Pharisee Gamaliel was trying to make with his fellow Jewish leaders in reference to the Christians, the followers of Jesus. Luke records that incident for us. Gamaliel stands up and he says, look, I know we're all concerned about these radical extremists called Christians, but even though they're non-violent, we're concerned about them. So let me give you my thinking on this. And Gamaliel says, here's what I think we ought to do. We ought to do nothing. I mean, if their movement, if their radical extremism is made of man, it's going to die. We know that from history. But if their radical extremism is of God, it will survive. And then to make his point, Luke says, and Gamaliel says, hey, do you remember Theodos, the radical extremist who thought he was the Messiah? He and his followers rose and died. And then Gamaliel says, you remember Judas the Galilean? He and his followers, his radical followers, they rose and they died. Gamaliel doesn't mention the Zealots or the Sicarii, because at that time they're still actively involved. But he didn't need to, because he had already made his point. Radical extremism dies if it's not of God. And so what did the fellow Jewish leaders do? After Gamaliel made his speech, he said, we like what you said. and we will do nothing. We won't take any formal action to rid ourselves of this threat called Christianity. And what happened? The Christians grew, and the Christian faith spread. And here we are some 2,000 years later. Amen? Amen. Not very strong today here in church on this Sunday, but we're strong in other places as well. But here we are, which goes to show you that really God must be with us as Christians, because we've survived for 2,000 plus some odd years. And so I take comfort in knowing that God is with us as Christians. But I also take comfort in the testimony of history. A testimony that says there will be radical extremism from time to time, but whenever it rises, you can bet it will fall and meet the fate of death. And so I take hope in that. I take hope in the words of Gamaliel, who said, if this movement is of man, it will fail. But if this movement is of God, it will succeed. Because you can't win if you're going to fight against God. Now, like many of you today, I'm concerned about radical groups in this world of ours that have sprung up over the last 15, 20 years. And I'm concerned about ISIS. I'm concerned about their impact upon the safety of our country and the safety of other countries as well. And I'm really concerned, like many of you, every time I hear that there are people from our country and other countries who are trying to join ISIS. That concerns me. Every time there's another beheading, every time there's another mass execution, my heart is heavy with concern. But even though my heart is heavy like yours, and even though I am concerned, again, I take hope in the testimony of history. A testimony that says radical extremism, like Theodus and his followers, like Judas the Galilean and his radical followers, like the Sicarii, die. They don't continue. They have their moment. They might win some battles, but eventually they die. And so I take hope in that. Now, like many of you, I'm sad when we as a nation and as a world, when we as Christians have to deal with groups and people that choose to become radicalized extremists. I wish it weren't that way. But that is one of the downsides of freedom. That wonderful gift that you and I have been given by God. One of the downsides of freedom is that there will be some people who will use their freedom to choose hate over love. And there will be people who will use their freedom to choose radical extremist beliefs over a belief system that is respectful to the diversity of thought that exists